So I'm Kevin Freeman with York History Group. Welcome, everybody. My friend Danny Bottino has joined me today. We're in York Village First Parish Cemetery behind the church, and Danny has some good news about a paper that he wrote with Hannah Peterson on Patients Boston. And Danny, tell us what happened to the paper after you wrote it, the process of its being published, and is it published, and especially is it available to people like me? Yeah.
All right. Well, there's excellent questions there. So Hannah and I started working on this project, which turned into the paper probably about 7 years ago. We were both working at the jail where Patients' cell is, and that's what really started Hannah out on being interested in Patients' history, because the cell where she lived for more than a year is of course still in the jail. And I came to be interested in Patients' history through studying Joseph Moody, son of Samuel Moody, the minister, and they were both ministers here in York in the 1730s, Joseph at the second parish in Scotland. And so Joseph really figures into Patients' story because the biggest and most important source we have on Patients' life is the narrative of which was edited by Samuel and Joseph, but told for the most part in Patients' voice. And that was published 3 years after she was hanged here in York for murder in 1738. And so, studying Joseph Moody, I came to be very interested in this narrative. And then Hannah and I said, we're both interested in this history, why don't we team up and do some research on, try to see what has been written on Patients, and if we can add to the research that has been done. There's been quite a bit of interest in Patients since this narrative is such a very detailed, very rich document.
Is it like one of the more comprehensive ones on a pre-execution?
Oh, definitely, yes. It's a new genre. So these are called criminal narratives, is the technical term.
Yeah.
But really, the criminal narratives of the 1600s, most of which were about criminals hanged in Boston, were written by Puritan ministers. Cotton Mather wrote quite a few of them. And they were very short, and they were about usually the last moments of the prisoner's life as they walked to the gallows. And sometimes there was a sermon that the minister, such as Cotton Mather, preached. But that was it, and they were very grim, because of course these were mostly murderers. So these were very grim narratives, and there was usually very little hope given in the narratives about whether these people would be saved. Patients is very different, very different.
Yeah, so what do you think the inspiration for the father and son Moody was to begin this narrative so early in the process of her death sentence and to carry it through so comprehensively?
Of course, Patients is different from prisoners in Boston because she was held in the jail for more than a year. The reason for that was because the court that tried capital crimes, the Supreme Court of Judicature, traveled to York only once yearly. And so when she was put into prison here, she had to wait for her case to be tried. If the court had, let's say she had come to York just a little bit earlier, it's quite possible that she would have been tried, very quickly and then sentenced to death. However, she was pregnant at the time also, so she wouldn't have been hanged anyway until she had given birth, which she did in the jail. So she was there for a very long time. And that gave Samuel and Joseph the opportunity, they say in their narrative, to go and talk to her. And there's also evidence that every Sunday, and maybe on other days, she came to the First Parish Church on the site of the current church and listened and took part in the service, and of course listened to the sermons preached by Samuel, and Joseph probably preached there too.
Excuse me, was she a self-proclaimed Christian at that point?
Yes, and the background of Patients is quite fascinating. Now, Patients was a member of the Nauset people. Now, the Nausets lived on the very end of Cape Cod, and there's a little island there called Monomoy, I believe. I don't know. I've just read it, so I don't know if that's the correct way to say it.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes an island, sometimes not. joined to the very end of Cape Cod, and that's where Patience says that she was born. And that was a so-called praying Indian town.
Yeah.
So the Nauset, the Nauset people were Protestant natives who had actually sent soldiers to fight with the colonists during King Philip's War in the 1670s. Now, Patience was born on the day after Christmas in 1711. So a few decades after King Philip's War ended. And she says in her narrative that she was raised by her parents as she says that her mother was a full member of the church there. Not her father, but her mother, Sarah Jethro, was a full member of the church. And of course, being a member of the church is something that doesn't just happen. You have to prove that you have been saved. Different churches had different ways to become a member, but it was a big honor and proved that you were, of course, a pious Christian.
Yeah.
And so her mother died when she was 3, she says in the narrative, and then her father bound her out as an indentured servant to an English family out close to her town, but of course not part of her native town. And then that family raised her, and so she was formally a Protestant Christian, of course, from the moment that she was born.
So it wasn't a matter of the Moody's trying to save her soul as much as it was an interest in maybe the prospect of understanding what she was feeling, because wasn't she kind of more expressive than they might have thought otherwise?
Certainly, I think that's a part of it, and here we get into the complicated sort of details of Calvinist theology, because you're right that the Moody's would not, if you asked them, are you trying to save Patience's soul, they would have said only God can save her. So, and in fact, according to strict Calvinist teaching, which we know Joseph Moody held to from his diary in the 1720s, everyone's soul has been predestined to be saved or damned. And so there's nothing you can do in your earthly life to stop that, because it's already happened. And so what the Moody's were trying to do in her, as we read in the narrative that they published, is that they're trying to help Patience come back to her Christian life. And of course, Patience says in her narrative that after her term of indenture ended and she was free, she fell into sinful ways. Drinking was her primary vice, drunkenness, but she says that she stole. Now, of course, she was on her own, so she presumably didn't even have a job at this point, so she probably was quite poor, which may be why she was stealing. Of course, then eventually, after she married a black man named Boston, who we think was worked on a whaling vessel. After she married him, she had 2 or 3 children with him, which all died very, very young. I believe the oldest lived to about 7 weeks. And this is what she says in her narrative, they all died naturally, but she at the time said that she had murdered them. And one of these cases was brought to trial, and at first Patience said, yes, I murdered this child, but there was no evidence that she had, indeed, because she hadn't. And eventually she changed her plea to not guilty, and then the judge said, yes, you are not guilty.
Wow. It's just amazing that there is so much information about this.
Yes, there is.
And the execution occurred in 1740?
1735, yes.
1735, okay.
July 1735.
Yeah, okay.
Can't remember the precise date, but it is in the narrative.
So you had all the court documents to glean from, and from the writings of the Moody's, and
yes.
And then the pamphlet that they wrote,
Yes.
they actually commercialized, and it was something
Yes.
that became a bestseller, maybe?
I think it was popular. Now, here's where if an expert is watching here, they would want me to say this, because there were 2 pamphlets. And this makes Patience's story, adds a little wrinkle to it, because there was a pamphlet published very soon after she was hanged in 1735, authored by Samuel and Joseph, and I believe 5 other ministers, I believe 7 ministers signed the pamphlet.
Wow.
Samuel and Joseph, and I believe 5 others. We'll have to
Wow.
check that to be certain. And this pamphlet is 8 pages. It's also in Patience's voice, and it is supposed to be the speech that she gave at the gallows.
Yeah.
And this is a more typical style of pamphlet. This is the typical genre, although it is different because she is hopeful that she has been saved.
So we can make an assumption that it was likely heavily edited by the
Right, and that's the big question. I think this one, was certainly edited.
So we don't have
Yes.
the notes. We don't have the actual notes that they took to compile this.
Right, we don't, and presumably, of course, someone, I would say probably Joseph, since he was used to doing this,
Yeah.
was probably taking her words down as she spoke at the gallows. From Joseph's diary, we
Yeah.
know that he took very good sermon notes, listening to his father preach.
Yeah. Wow.
And then this pamphlet is followed 3 years later by the more famous pamphlet. That's the 1738 narrative. Full title is A Faithful Narrative of the Life and Conversion of Patience Boston, I believe. So narrative is the short title that I use, but a faithful narrative.
Yeah.
And that word faithful is key, because that's what by faithful the Moody's mean accurate.
Yeah.
They may be punning a little bit there, because of course the point of the narrative is the core of the narrative is Patience gaining faith in God and in God saving her.
Okay.
So it could be
Play
a play on words there, right?
Yeah.
And the 1738 narrative has 3 parts. It's 38 pages long in its printed form, and it has a preface by Samuel and Joseph saying that this is mostly Patience's words, which we have taken down.
Yeah.
However, it's not completely accurate, because of course we could only write down what she said, and we couldn't quite capture
So
every word.
they do put a disclaimer in.
Yes, definitely.
Huh.
And then so what follows is the edited text of Patience's voice, starting with her birth. We've already talked about that. She gives a narrative of her childhood in Monomoy, right?
Yeah.
And then she talks about how she got married, about these children that I mentioned, and eventually she says that she murdered the son of her master. So she was back to being a servant at this point in Falmouth, modern day Portland, not modern day Falmouth. And this was in 1734. And she says that she drowned the 8-year-old grandson of her master named Benjamin Trott. Her master was a man named Benjamin Skillen. And so there were no witnesses to this. And she says that the jury brought in a verdict of willful murder. Now, I believe what she means by that this is not a trial jury, this is a grand jury. Now, Patience was not, I think, knowledgeable of the technical terms. So
yeah, likely not.
And it is interesting that, of course, Samuel and Joseph were certainly, and they were editing this, so it's interesting that they didn't actually edit it to say grand jury. They just kept her, which might be a piece of evidence that this is accurate. Some of it is accurately her own words. So the narrative says that the jury brought in willful murder. I think that's a grand jury that met and said that yes, there is a possibility that she murdered this child. And I think a coroner's jury met too. 2 separate types of jury. The coroner's jury would have met first and said that yes, the coroner's jury was to look at the body and say, how did this person die? And Patience says that the jury in front of the jury, probably the coroner's jury, she was asked to touch the body. And in fact, she asked to be able to. This is the touch test, the ancient test, which in English folklore, and it got into English law too, is that if a murderer touches a dead corpse and the blood flows, and of course usually corpse the blood doesn't flow, or the blood rises was a term also used, so the skin would become red. And patients asked to undergo the touch test, as she says in the narrative. And so she touched the body, and she says the body did not bleed, which she believes, she says in the narrative, was God testing her, because of course patient says that I am guilty, so God is giving me an opportunity to say, to get out of this, basically. I think that's how it's framed in the narrative. Of course, I think that it also represents the facts that she probably did touch the body and the blood probably didn't flow. So that's the facts of what happened, and Samuel, Joseph, and patients have to deal with those facts. They have to frame them somehow.
So during this process, do you have a feeling that Patience actually was hoping to die?
That is a very controversial point. And Patience, interestingly, pled guilty at the trial. So she was sent here after the coroner's jury and the grand jury, waited in the jail, and when the court came, pled guilty. Now, of course, this, even at the time, if you were guilty of a capital crime, almost always would plead not guilty, so the jury could try you, even if it was obvious. And in this case, of course, it wasn't obvious because there were no witnesses. Joseph Quasson, who was interestingly also a Nauset man from Patience's own village, had been tried for murder in York in previous decades, 1925, because he was serving with the English forces during Dummer's War, and he had killed one of his fellow soldiers. And this was pretty obvious. There were witnesses. It was a drunken fight. He had shot him, and then he was eventually hanged in New York. Yet in the court record for Quasson, which I found, it says he pled not guilty. Now, it was obvious that Quasson had killed him, and he was found guilty. But yet he pled not guilty.
And he was exonerated?
He was found guilty. Yes.
Oh, he was found guilty.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, so the fact, which makes it even more extraordinary that Patience would plead guilty, and I think that there was controversy about this at the time, because Patience even says in the narrative, the judge questioned her closely and said, "Do you realize, basically, by pleading guilty, that we have to sentence you to death because that's the only punishment for a murder?" And she said, "Yes, I know I'm guilty, so I'm going to plead guilty." And the narrative further states that Samuel Moody said that he had suffered reproach, is the word that he uses, for Patience. And it's not clear what that means. And I think what's going on is that many people in York, perhaps throughout the region, thought that Samuel and Joseph, and maybe the other ministers in the 1735 pamphlet, were basically forcing her, or at least sort of pushing her towards pleading guilty, because that served their narrative of having saved her.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty complicated.
Yes, and I think some people were pretty angry about that in York. Samuel Moody was not, although popular with many people, was with some people not very well liked. We know that from Joseph Moody's diary.
Yeah. Yeah, what a frightening time to live, and then to have this event going on in York. And I want to finish up by asking you, so you co-authored this with Hannah Peterson.
Yes, I want to talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to how that went. Oh, but ultimately, before we do go, you have to tell us if this is available for public consumption currently.
I do want to get to that, definitely. Yes. So, eventually, we finally started writing the article in 2020, and we sent it in to a journal which was recommended to me by some of the Rutgers faculty that I'm working with, where I'm getting my PhD currently. And this is the Journal of Early American Studies, EAS, which is published by Penn Press, University of Pennsylvania. And
come this way a little bit.
And the article will be coming out finally in their summer 2023 issue, and that, I presume, based on their previous, they haven't told us yet, will be in August. Now, in every issue of their journal, from what I can tell, they have usually one article free.
Nice.
Now, I don't know if this is going to be the free article.
Okay.
So hopefully it is the free article. But if
Hopefully.
it's not the free article, then you can buy, I believe it's $20, maybe $20 for students, $40 for non-students,
Okay.
to buy, to gain access to the journal, and then they mail you a physical copy of the journal as well as giving you digital access to
Wow,
it.
sounds like a great journal just to subscribe to anyways.
Yeah, they've got excellent articles.
Yeah.
In fact, in the issue which just came out, the spring issue, one of my Rutgers colleagues who has graduated now, a guy named Zach Bennett, wrote an excellent article on Maine history. It's about I haven't read the article yet, but when I talked to him, he told me about it. It's about Wabanaki usage of rivers, and specifically boats on the rivers during their wars with the English.
Oh. Was he at that talk at Mass Historical?
I don't
Did
think
he
he's
have an
there.
undergrad from Harvard?
No,
Okay.
a different guy.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay. I
yes.
thought his last name was Bennett.
Yeah. So I'd recommend that article
Yeah,
too.
and then you said also you and Hannah are co-writing a blog.
Yes. So Hannah and I also, the journal runs a separate blog, which I believe is called EAS Miscellany, and we're writing an essay for their blog, which should be coming out in July probably. And this article, this essay is going to be on Old York's burial ground as a public history site, and of course, public history is something both of us think is really critical, and graveyards in general are wonderful for public history. We use sources, gravestones, from this graveyard in our article.
Yeah.
And so in the blog, we're going to talk about how people can do this for massive swaths of history in general, just by looking at graveyards like this one.
Yeah.
Here, the modern one in back of the church.
Yeah, and before we began this, we were talking a little bit about nobody really knows where Patience Boston was buried, but we believe that she was hung on Jail Hill.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Almost certainly the gallows was on Jail Hill. For Joseph Quasson that I mentioned, it says in his narrative, which was also published by Samuel Moody, it says that he was brought to the gallows over a long distance.
Yeah.
And it says that the gallows were in some sort of valley in York. So James has told me that he thinks that was at Stage Neck.
Yeah.
And however, in Patience's narrative, there is no mention of her going on a long journey.
Yeah.
And so we think almost certainly, that she was hanged on Jail Hill. And in Banks's History of York, I forgot in which volume, but I found this recently and I was shocked. Banks talks about how there were old people who were interviewed in the 1800s, and there was this was 1830s, I think. There was controversy over the glebe land, of course. This controversy has always been part of York history.
Yeah.
And they were asked, how did the town use this land when you were young in the 1700s? And the old people said that there was a gallows in the center of York Village.
Yeah.
So I think that is the definite proof that we needed, that certainly there was a gallows on Jail Hill.
Yeah.
Now, in English custom, criminals, this is true all the way up until the end of capital punishment in England in the 1960s, criminals were hanged close to the gallows. So, it's possible that Patience was buried on Jail Hill. But I think, of course, since the graveyard was right there, the burial ground was right there, and Patience was highly valued by Samuel and Joseph. Of course, Samuel is the minister, so he's in charge of the graveyard.
Yeah.
Or at least has power over the graveyard, certainly. I think he would have wanted her to be buried with the other citizens of York in the village burying ground. Yeah. And of course, there is no grave marker, but I'm pretty sure that she's buried there.
Yeah. Also, people might not know, Danny, and I'm pretty sure that you do work at Old York Historical Society as a guide, and you give tours at this exact cemetery.
I would like to talk about that.
Yeah, so if you want to go over to Old York, how can people find out when you're going to be giving a tour?
Well, so we are giving walking tours this summer, and believe that the walking tours are on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And then on Fridays and Saturdays, we're giving house tours of the Perkins house, which I'm looking forward to.
Oh, good. Okay.
And so the walking tours, there's many different themes, and most of them, almost all of them, take place in the burial ground.
Yeah.
And there's different themes you can talk about. We talk about history of slavery is one of the walking tours, history of loyalists in York. Of course, Jonathan Sayward's buried there. My favorite tour is just a history of the art. What can we learn about how gravestones were carved, how that changed over time?
And Danny, I know you share everything you know with everybody. So if
Yes.
somebody's going to take a tour and you want to ask Danny questions, just ask him, and you're going to be able to find out all that you want to know about any subject in the graveyard.
Definitely.
And also, Danny is a member of York History Group. So for York History Group members, just you can message Danny on York History Group, and I'm sure he's going to reply to any questions that you have. So
Yes, definitely.
So I think that's our bell, Danny. I think the time is up.
Oh,
So everybody have a great night. Thank you so much, Danny. And thanks to Hannah Peterson for co-writing this article that I'm looking forward to
we
reading.
could also mention the YouTube video that we did with him.
Oh, yeah. So there is a video that we did for York History Group Live. It was in the winter of 2022, I believe, and it was with Danny and Hannah. And I got to interview them about this whole story of Patience Boston also, which is fascinating. And in a way, it's very disturbing. And so but it's such an integral part of the history, early York history, that we have a really comprehensive version of.
Yes.
Whether it's 100% true, we're not sure, but it's relevant.
Yes.
So thank you, Danny.
Definitely. And even if it's not entirely accurate, there's always something to be learned from it.
There you go.
Yes.
I like that. Take care, everybody.